So now we have the privilege of inviting Joseph Stiglitz to speak of care economy and sustainable growth. To give a brief introduction, Professor Joseph Stiglitz is University Professor of Economics at Columbia University. He's also the laureate of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. He's well recognized for his pioneering work in the economics field. And he's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD. Let us now meet Professor Joseph Stiglitz on video.
It is a real pleasure to be here to talk to you about reimagining the post-pandemic future, transformation towards a caring society. We are emerging now from one of the most traumatic events of history, the COVID-19 pandemic. The silver lining on this traumatic event is that it has provided a moment of reflection where we've analyzed where we are and where we want to be. That's why what is happening in many countries around the world is so important. There is a resolve to build back better, to create a greener economy, a more inclusive society, to further structural transformations that were on the way, but have been in many ways accelerated by the pandemic itself. A movement towards a knowledge and a more innovative economy. The pandemic itself exposed the inequities in our societies and aggravated them. It exposed other flaws, both in our public and our private sector. It showed that 40 years of denigrating the role of government has had its effect, and the governments were less prepared to do what they were supposed to do, to respond to the disease, to provide care to our citizens. But even the private sector showed enormous deficiencies. While the past 40 years has led to a weakening of the public sector, it has created a private sector that is actually less resilient than it was in earlier eras. I've been long engaged in an agenda trying to understand and develop better metrics of economic performance and societal progress. Part of this agenda is to understand the flaws in the existing metrics, GDP, which are focused on growth, on material growth, an increase in the amount of goods that are produced. This agenda of developing better measures and criticizing existing measures is important because what you measure affects what you do. We held a very important meeting, international meeting on this topic here in Seoul just a few years ago, shortly before the pandemic. Among the things that GDP does not take into account is the value of security, the value of our environment, our health. But nowhere are the gaps in our measurement greater than in assessing and evaluating our social relationships, including those that go in to measuring and assessing our caring economy. Of course, we all talk about the value of education of our children, the value of caring for our sick, the value of caring for our elderly. But unfortunately, our metrics don't really adequately reflect that. And because the way we approach this is like we approach so many other things. We're trying to always save costs. And saving costs means lowering compensation for those who provide this kind of care. Historically, many of those who provided this kind of care have been discriminated against groups, women, immigrants. And unfortunately, today, even as we work hard to eliminate those forms of discrimination, the market takes advantage of the legacy of that discrimination, paying workers in these areas far less than we as a society should value the services that they provide. The value of those services is not really a market-determined matter. It is a matter that we as a society need to decide together. For important reasons, these services are disproportionately within the public sector. And therefore, how much we allocate to support these services, education of our children, healthcare, caring of the elderly, will determine how much we pay for those who provide these services. If we truly care for our children, our sick, our elderly, then we'll provide more adequate compensation for these services. And we will show in doing so that we truly value the services. There are other dimensions of this caring economy. The nature of our economy is going to be changing. It's ever changing. But one important aspect is that population will be stabilizing. It will be necessary if we are to live within our planetary boundaries. Growth rates will, as a result, slow. But we shouldn't confuse the slowing of growth rates as measured by GDP as a lowering of standards of living. In fact, standards of living can continue to rise even as our population rates of growth reduced, and even as we meet the challenge of climate change. President Biden has emphasized investments as part of infrastructure and sustainable growth agenda. Health is important in its own right, but health is also important, evident as part of the pandemic, and is necessary for having a productive labor force. So too for the quality of education. And this is even more true so if we are to have a more creative and innovative economy. Let me conclude and return to the theme of the topic of this talk, the post-pandemic, more inclusive, more resilient economy. We have to have greater equality and greater equality of opportunity, and that will require access, greater access, equality of access to healthcare, to health education, to caring services. That means, in turn, there has to be reliance on public provision. Strengthening our caring economy is one way of making our economy more resilient. It also will strengthen our economy in another way. There is a great importance of trust. That's been shown in this last pandemic. Those countries where there is greater trust have performed better. Trust is undermined by inequalities. And if we can do something to reduce the divides within our society, I think we'll create a society with greater trust, and therefore society will perform better. The weaknesses in our care structure helped explain our vulnerability. The strength in our education and our research were critical in the fight against COVID-19. They enabled us to diagnose what was causing these deaths and to develop vaccines in record time. So COVID-19 has been a moment of reflection. Some countries are seizing on that moment of reflection to build back better. Just as we've learned a lot from how different countries have responded to COVID-19, we will learn a lot from how they build back better. Korea has, I think rightly, been held up as one of the countries that addressed COVID-19 pandemic well. I hope my remarks provide some guidance to how Korea might better manage the post-pandemic world and helping create the transformation towards a caring society. Thank you.
We had the privilege of hearing from Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you very much for your valuable message on how we should learn from the COVID-19 experience and how we should place care at the center of reconceptualizing the economy.